The dismissal was a small, precise cruelty, delivered with the faint smile Lady Honora Rothwell reserved for public humiliations. "My dear Prudence," she said, her voice like honey laced with frost, "do put away your little scribblings. Mr. Garrick is not interested in your fantasies of turnips and soil." Prudence Rothwell did not flush. She did not protest. She simply closed the leather-bound notebook in her lap, the worn cover a familiar comfort beneath her fingertips. Inside, pages of neat, sloping script detailed a 7-year crop rotation for heavy clay soil, plans for a south-facing cold frame, and a list of apple varieties resistant to canker. They were not fantasies. They were solutions. But here, in her aunt's suffocatingly polite drawing room in Maryvale, solutions were an impertinence. Her value lay in her silence, her swift hands pouring tea, her ability to become part of the furniture. She placed the notebook beside her chair, a silent testament to a life lived in the margins. For 7 years, since her father's death had left her a penniless orphan in her aunt's care, Prudence had been the invisible engine of the Rothwell household. She managed the accounts, stretched the dwindling budget, mended the linens, and oversaw the kitchen with a quiet competence that was both exploited and resented. Her only inheritance was a trunk of her father's books, not poetry or philosophy, but dense agricultural treatises, botanical sketches, and his own meticulously kept journals from a life spent trying to make stubborn land yield its best. These books, and the knowledge within them, were her only true possession. Across the room, her cousin Louisa giggled, a fluttery, pointless sound. "Oh, Mama, you are dreadful. Prudence is always so serious with her little projects." Louisa was everything Prudence was not: fair, charming, and utterly devoid of a single practical thought. It was for Louisa's benefit that this tea was being held, a delicate net cast for a suitable husband. Mr. Fletcher Garrick, the intended catch, inclined his head. He was a handsome man with a polished manner and an estate that bordered the Duke of Kestrel Chase's own lands. "A commendable hobby, Miss Rothwell," he said, his eyes flicking over Prudence with a dismissive gleam. "Every lady should have her horticultural pursuits." The word hung in the air, reducing her father's life's work to a genteel pastime, like needlepoint. Prudence met his gaze and gave a small, non-committal nod. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. Arguing changed nothing. Dignity was a shield, and she wore hers like armor. And then, a voice, low and devoid of inflection, cut through the cloying atmosphere. "What kind of soil?" The question was so unexpected, so abrupt, that the room fell silent. It came from the corner where the Duke of Kestrel Chase sat, a man who had not uttered more than 3 words since his arrival. Gideon Sinclair was a figure of rumor and shadow. A widower, some said. A war hero broken by what he had seen, said others. He was impossibly wealthy, formidably powerful, and lived in near total seclusion at his vast, neglected estate. His presence today was a rare and baffling concession to county society. Lady Honora's smile tightened. The Duke was the true prize, of course, but one deemed utterly unattainable. "Your Grace?" she stammered. Gideon Sinclair's gaze was not on his hostess. It was fixed on Prudence. It was a gray, unreadable gaze, like a winter sea. "The soil," he repeated, his voice raspy from disuse. "What kind of soil are your plans for?" Prudence felt a strange jolt, a flicker of stunned surprise. No one ever asked about the details. No one ever cared. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then answered, her voice clear and steady. "Heavy clay, with a high water table, Your Grace." It requires significant amendment with sand and compost to improve drainage, and a careful selection of deep-rooted vegetables, like parsnips, to break up the pan. She did not elaborate. She did not gush. She stated facts, plainly and precisely, as she had written them in her notebook. A strange stillness held the Duke's face. He did not smile or commend her. He simply watched her, his attention so absolute, it was like a physical weight. Mr. Garrick shifted, a flicker of irritation crossing his features at having lost the room's focus. Lady Honora rushed to fill the silence with chatter about a forthcoming ball, but the moment had shifted. For the first time in 7 years, someone had looked past the quiet, drab companion and seen the mind at work behind her eyes. Gideon Sinclair had seen her. And in the cold, silent world he inhabited, he was a man who noticed things others overlooked. He noticed the steady hands that closed the notebook. He noticed the absence of apology in her eyes, and he filed the information away, a single intriguing fact in a life barren of them. The blight began as a whisper, a rumor of blackened leaves in the tenant farms bordering the fenlands. Within a month, it was a foul-smelling certainty, a rot that crept through the potato fields of the county, turning the promise of a harvest into a stinking, inedible mush. What the blight did not take, a relentless summer rain ruined, flattening the wheat and turning the oats to mold. By September, the price of flour in Maryvale had tripled. The faces of the townspeople grew pinched with worry. For the wealthy, it was an inconvenience. For the poor, it was the preamble to starvation. At Kestrel Chase, the Duke's vast and sprawling estate, the crisis was acute. Generations of Sinclair Dukes had treated the land as a backdrop for sport and leisure, its fields lying fallow or leased out at indifferent terms. The great house, with its skeleton staff and silent, dust-sheeted wings, was a monument to neglect. It produced nothing. Now, with supply lines threatened and winter approaching, its vulnerability was laid bare. Gideon Sinclair, a man who had commanded regiments and navigated the intricate strategies of war, found himself facing a siege from his own empty larders. He sat in his study, a room of dark wood and darker memories, staring at the bleak reports from his land agent. The man was competent but unimaginative, wringing his hands and speaking of buying grain from the north at exorbitant prices. It was a solution of money, not of substance. Gideon's gaze drifted to the window, to the hundreds of acres of ornamental parkland, manicured and useless. He thought of the woman from the tea party. Heavy clay requires significant amendment. He had not been able to forget her. It was not her beauty. She was not beautiful in the manner of her cousin Louisa. It was the quality of her mind, the calm precision of her answer. It was the dignity with which she had endured her aunt's casual cruelty. She had spoken of problems and solutions, of reality, in a room full of meaningless chatter. In his world, a world of loss and silent grief since the death of his wife 3 years prior, reality was the only thing he trusted. He made his decision with the same swift, unsentimental logic he had once applied to battlefields. He dispatched a note to Lady Honora Rothwell, a single sentence, requesting a private interview on a matter of urgency. When he was shown into the same drawing room 2 days later, he wasted no time on pleasantries. Lady Honora and a hopeful, preening Louisa sat opposite him, Expecting what? A donation to a local charity? An offer for a prize stallion? Gideon's eyes found Prudence, standing quietly by the mantelpiece, as if ready to fetch or serve. "Miss Rothwell," he said, his voice commanding the room. "I require your assistance." Lady Honora bristled. "Your Grace, if it is a matter of household management, I am sure My business is with your niece," Gideon stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned his full attention to Prudence. "My estate is failing. It has been ornamental for too long. It needs to become productive. Immediately. I am told you have expertise." Prudence's heart hammered against her ribs. She met his gaze, unflinching. "I have studied the subject, Your Grace." "I am not looking for a scholar," he said bluntly. "I am looking for a strategist. I have 500 acres of fallow parkland, a depleted staff, and a winter approaching. I am offering you a position. You will have full authority over the agricultural conversion of Kestrel Chase. You will have a budget, a staff to command, and my complete support. In return, you will make the estate self-sufficient before the snows." The silence that followed was thick with shock. Louisa's mouth hung agape. Lady Honora's face was a mask of disbelief and fury. That this offer, this incredible opportunity was being made to the drab, useless Prudence was an insult beyond measure. "That is highly irregular, Your Grace," Lady Honora finally managed. "A young, unmarried woman in such a position of authority. Her reputation—" Gideon's gaze did not flicker. He had anticipated this. He had planned for it. "Her reputation will be unimpeachable. She will have the protection of my name." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "I am proposing marriage." If the first offer had been a shock, this was a cataclysm. Prudence felt the blood drain from her face. Marriage? To this cold, silent, powerful man. It was not a proposal of love or affection. It was a contract, a business transaction. He was offering her a title, a home, a life of unimaginable scope in exchange for her knowledge. He was offering her an escape. "A duchess?" Louisa whispered, the word full of childish envy. Lady Honora saw it all in a flash. The connection to the dukedom, the prestige, the victory over every other matchmaking mother in the county. Her initial fury was instantly supplanted by avaricious calculation. She could not possibly refuse. But Gideon was not looking at Lady Honora. His eyes were on Prudence, and Prudence alone. It was her decision. He was not asking her aunt. He was not commanding. He was asking. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw the steel. He saw the mind that understood systems, the spirit that had refused to be broken. He was offering her a cage of gold, perhaps, but one in which she would have the freedom to work, to create, to be valued for what she could do, not who she was. Prudence thought of the endless days of pouring tea, of mending Louisa's torn lace, of biting back the intelligent remark, the practical suggestion. She thought of her father's notebooks, filled with plans she had never dared to dream she could implement. This man was not offering her his heart. He was offering her 500 acres of heavy clay soil. To Prudence, it felt like the same thing. She lifted her chin. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it resonated with a strength that surprised them all. "I accept, Your Grace." The wedding was a spare, hurried affair at the parish church in Maryvale. attended only by a grimly triumphant Lady Honora, a pouting Louisa, and the Duke's solicitor. There were no flowers, no music, only the stark exchange of vows before a bewildered vicar. Prudence wore her best gray wool dress, the same one she had worn to her father's funeral. Gideon stood beside her, a tall, remote figure in black, his face as unreadable as ever. When he placed the heavy gold band on her finger, his hand was cool and impersonal. It was a sealing of a contract, nothing more. The journey to Kestrel Chase was made in a cavernous, perfectly sprung coach, in near-complete silence.
Prudence sat opposite her new husband, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her father's notebooks in a small valise at her feet. She was now the Duchess of Kestrel Chase. The title felt like a borrowed costume, ill-fitting and absurd. She was Prudence Rothwell, the girl who knew how to graft an apple tree and calculate seed yields per acre. What did she know of being a duchess? As the coach turned onto the long, winding drive, the full scale of her undertaking became apparent. The parkland, designed by a famous landscape artist a century before, rolled on for miles, a sea of useless, perfect green. Majestic oaks stood in splendid isolation, their shade poisoning the ground for any useful crop. A serpentine lake, beautiful and sterile, consumed acres that could have fed a village. It was a landscape built for looking at, not for living in. It was the physical embodiment of the Sinclair legacy, magnificent, unproductive, and hollow. The house itself rose from the landscape like a cliff of pale stone. Kestrel Chase was not a home. It was a statement. Symmetrical, severe, and enormous, its dozens of windows stared out like vacant eyes. When the coach drew to a halt, the great oak doors were opened by a severe-looking butler, and standing behind him was a line of perhaps a dozen servants, a ghost of the 100 who would have served the estate in its heyday. Their faces were wary, their curiosity veiled by professional deference. At their head was a woman in a crisp black dress with a formidable set of keys at her waist. Her hair was pulled back in a tight gray bun, and her expression was one of ingrained skepticism. "Your Grace," the butler announced, "may I present Mrs. Ingram, the housekeeper." Mrs. Tilly Ingram's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, swept over Prudence, taking in the plain dress, the absence of jewels, the determined set of her jaw. There was no welcome in that gaze, only judgment. Gideon spoke for the first time since they had left the church. "Mrs. Ingram, Her Grace will require a full accounting of the household stores and staff. She has my full authority. See that her instructions are followed, without question." His voice held the quiet, absolute command of a man used to being obeyed. Mrs. Ingram gave a stiff, formal curtsy. "As you wish, Your Grace." But her eyes, still on Prudence, promised nothing. Gideon led Prudence into the cavernous marble hall. Their footsteps echoed in the cold, silent space. He gestured vaguely towards a sweeping grand staircase. "Your rooms are in the east wing. Mine are in the west. We will dine together at 8. Until then, the house is at your disposal." And with that, he turned and walked away down a long corridor, his footsteps receding, leaving her alone in the immense, echoing hall. She was the Duchess. This was her house. And she had never felt so utterly alone. She stood there for a long moment, the silence pressing in on her. Then she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and turned to the housekeeper. "Mrs. Ingram," she said, her voice steady, "please begin with the kitchens." The tour of the kitchens and larders was a grim education in neglect. The great ranges were cold, the copper pots tarnished. The pantries held little more than sacks of refined white flour,
jars of imported preserves, and barrels of salted fish. It was the diet of wealth and convenience, utterly disconnected from the land on which the house stood. In a small, cold scullery, Prudence found the only sign of life: a handful of herbs growing in a cracked terracotta pot on the windowsill. Rosemary, thyme, and winter savory. A kitchen maid named Bess admitted to tending them. "There's a walled garden, Your Grace," the girl offered timidly. "But it's not been worked in years, since the old Duchess passed." Prudence's heart gave a small leap. A walled garden. A space with boundaries, with potential. "Show me," she commanded. The walled garden was a place of beautiful decay.
An acre of land, enclosed by high brick walls, lay choked with brambles and weeds. The glass in the greenhouses was shattered, the frames rotting. An ancient, gnarled apple tree stood at its center, its branches barren. But the walls faced south. The soil, when Prudence crumbled a handful between her fingers, was a rich, dark loam, protected from the thin, acidic soil of the parkland. It was a ruin, but it was a ruin with good bones. This would be her beachhead. She did not begin by issuing grand orders from the house. The next morning, dressed in a sturdy pair of her late father's work boots she had packed and a plain wool skirt, she walked to the garden. She had the head gardener, a taciturn old man named Obadiah, and 2 young lads meet her there. They watched, astonished, as the new Duchess picked up a 3-pronged fork and began methodically clearing the matted roots of couch grass from a small 10-foot square of earth. "Your Grace," Obadiah protested, his face a mask of horrified propriety. "This is not fitting work." "The only work that is not fitting, Obadiah," Prudence replied without looking up, her hands already deep in the cool soil, "is work that does not get done. The ground is still warm enough to plant winter greens and broad beans if we move quickly. We will start here." For a week, this was her routine. From dawn until the light failed, she worked alongside the men, her hands becoming calloused, her face smudged with dirt. She spoke little, but her actions spoke for her. She knew the difference between a weed and a seedling. She understood the rhythm of the work, the ache in the back, the satisfaction of a cleared bed. The gardeners, who had expected a fine lady playing at farming, began to watch her with a grudging respect. From his study window, which overlooked the distant walled garden, Gideon watched her. He saw the small figure in gray, bent to her task day after day. He had expected her to manage from a distance, to direct with lists and plans. He had not expected this. He had not expected to see his wife, the Duchess, on her knees in the dirt. It was not pity he felt. It was something harder and more respectful. It was a flicker of profound curiosity about the woman he had married. One afternoon, as a cold drizzle began to fall, Prudence was working alone, trying to mend a broken cold frame with salvaged panes of glass. Her fingers were numb, her back ached, but the task absorbed her completely. She did not hear the footsteps on the gravel path behind her until a voice spoke. "You will catch a chill." She looked up, startled, to see Gideon standing there, holding a large, dark cloak. He did not offer it to her. He simply held it, his expression unreadable. "The work must be done, Your Grace," she said, her breath misting in the cold air. "My name is Gideon," he said. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. He stepped forward and, without another word, draped the heavy, wool-lined cloak around her shoulders. It was warm from his body and smelled faintly of old books and winter air. The gesture was impersonal, practical, yet it felt like the most intimate thing that had ever happened to her. He looked at the work she had done, the neat, cleared beds, the repaired frame. "It is a start," he said. "Yes," she agreed, pulling the cloak tighter around herself. "It is a start." He nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the great, cold house. Prudence watched him go, her heart beating a little faster. In the silent, transactional world they had built, a shared warmth, a spoken name felt like a seismic shift. Back in the house, Mrs. Ingram, who had seen the entire exchange from a pantry window, went to the kitchen and gave an order. When Prudence finally returned, soaked and weary, there was a steaming cup of sweetened tea and a plate of buttered toast waiting for her by the fire in her room. No one said a word about where it came from. It was simply there. The loyalty of Kestrel Chase was beginning, ever so slowly, to turn. By the first frost, the walled garden was transformed. Neat rows of kale, chard, and winter lettuces grew under the repaired cold frames. The beds were mulched, the compost heaps turned, and the old apple tree pruned back with a surgeon's care. The change was not confined to the garden. Prudence, armed with her notebooks and a growing understanding of the estate, began her assault on the parkland. She did not tear down the ancient oaks. Instead, she brought in a herd of pigs, allowing them to forage for acorns and rootle in the compacted soil, aerating and fertilizing it naturally. In a sheltered meadow, she had the gardeners plow long, straight furrows, preparing the land for a hard winter wheat, a variety her father had noted for its resilience. She pored over the estate ledgers at night, her clear script filling new pages with budgets, schedules, and calculations. The house began to change, too. The scent of baking bread replaced the musty smell of disuse. Mrs. Ingram, now a staunch, if silent, ally, found her orders were no longer questioned by the staff. The new Duchess was strange, yes, but she was fair. Her expectations were clear, and under her guidance, the house was stirring from its long slumber. It was into this fragile, burgeoning new world that Lady Honora and Louisa Rothwell arrived for a visit, ostensibly to see how their dear Prudence was faring. They swept into Kestrel Chase in a cloud of perfume and silk, their eyes wide with a mixture of envy and predatory curiosity. Lady Honora surveyed the great hall, where vases of autumn foliage now stood on polished tables. "How rustic, my dear," she commented, her tone implying it was a failing. "One almost expects to find chickens roosting on the statuary." Louisa giggled. "Prudence, your hands! They are quite ruined. What must the Duke think?" Prudence looked down at her hands. The nails were short, and there was a line of honest dirt beneath them that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. She felt a flash of the old shame, the familiar sting of her aunt's disapproval. But then she looked up and met the woman's gaze. "The Duke," she said, her voice even, "thinks of the harvest." The visit was a week of 1,000 tiny cuts. Lady Honora offered unsolicited advice on how a duchess should dress, how she should entertain, how she must at all costs conceal her unseemly interest in agriculture. She treated the staff with imperious disdain, undoing weeks of Prudence's quiet work to build morale. Louisa trailed through the house, complaining of boredom, and dropping careless, pitying remarks about Prudence's strange marriage within earshot of the maids. They left as they came, in a flurry of insincere farewells. But they left a poison behind them. In the weeks that followed, whispers from Merivale began to reach Kestrel Chase. The new Duchess, the rumors said, was an eccentric,
a madwoman who preferred the company of pigs to people. She was squandering the Sinclair fortune on harebrained schemes, digging up the beautiful parkland. She was shaming her noble husband. The architect of the most damaging rumors was Mr. Fletcher Garrick. His own estate, a model of modern, profitable farming, had long been the standard in the county. Prudence's success, and the Duke's clear support of her, was a direct challenge to his standing. He began to speak of her in public houses and at market day, his handsome face etched with false concern. "A noble experiment, of course," he would say with a sigh. "But the Duchess's methods are untested, dangerous even. She will exhaust the soil, mark my words. A terrible shame for such a historic estate." His first direct move was an attempt to poach Obadiah, the head gardener, offering him double his wages. The old man, who had once viewed Prudence with deep suspicion, now refused flatly. "I'm staying with her grace," he told the other gardeners. "She knows the land." Failing that, Garrick's attacks grew more specific. Prudence had sourced a large quantity of seed potatoes from a coastal merchant, a rare, blight-resistant variety her father had praised in his journals. They were crucial for the winter stores, not just for the house, but for the Duke's tenants, whose own crops had failed. As the potatoes were being sorted in the stables, Garrick paid a visit, ostensibly to offer neighborly advice. He examined a tuber, his lip curling in faint disgust. "From the coast, you say? Risky, Duchess. The sea air carries all manner of rots. I would be most careful." Prudence thanked him coolly for his concern and had the potatoes stored in a dry, dark cellar, separate from all other produce, a quarantine measure she had insisted upon. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The tenants, already frightened, began to murmur amongst themselves. They looked to the Duke, their silent, formidable landlord, wondering if he knew that his strange new wife was gambling with their survival. Gideon, for his part, remained a silent observer, his faith in Prudence an unspoken, untested thing. He had given her his authority. Now he watched and waited to see if she could hold it. The crisis broke on a cold, gray morning in late October. A young stable boy, sent to the cellar to fetch a sack of the new potatoes for planting in the greenhouse beds, came running back, his face pale with terror. "They're rotten, your grace! Black and foul, the lot of them!" Prudence's blood ran cold. She hurried to the cellar, Obadiah at her heels. The moment they opened the door, the smell hit them. The same sweet, putrid stench of the blight that had haunted the county all summer. Inside, the sacks of carefully sourced seed potatoes were collapsing into a corrupt, slimy mass. Weeks of planning, a significant portion of her budget, and the cornerstone of her plan for winter sustenance were gone. It was a catastrophe. Within hours, the news had spread like fire through the tenant farms. Panic turned to anger. It was the new Duchess's fault. It was her foreign, coastal potatoes that had brought the blight into the very heart of Kestrel Chase. Mr. Garrick's warnings had come true. Fletcher Garrick himself arrived that afternoon, his face a perfect mask of solemn concern. He found Prudence and Gideon in the stable yard, where the ruined sacks were being prepared for burning. A small, anxious crowd of tenants had gathered at a respectful distance. "A tragedy, Duke. An absolute tragedy," Garrick said, loud enough for all to hear. He turned to Prudence, his voice dripping with pity. "I did warn you, Duchess. Some soils, some methods, they are simply not suited. You cannot force the land."
He was not just offering condolences, he was pronouncing judgment. He was publicly declaring her a failure. The tenants murmured their agreement. Prudence felt their fear and their blame like a physical blow. She looked at their pinched faces, at the ruin in the cellar, at the smug, false sympathy on Garrick's face. For a moment, the weight of it all was crushing. Then she looked at her husband. Gideon had been silent throughout, his face carved from stone. He watched the scene, his gray eyes moving from Garrick to the tenants, and finally to her. She could not read his expression. She did not know if he believed her, or if he, too, saw this as the disastrous end of his gamble. Later, in the suffocating silence of his study, the moment of testing finally came. The door was closed. The house was quiet. It was just the two of them. "Is he right?" Gideon asked. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which made the question cut even deeper. "Did your ambition outstrip your knowledge? Did you bring this upon us?" This was the true crisis. Not the loss of the crop, but the potential loss of his trust. The foundation of their strange partnership was his belief in her competence. If that was gone, everything was gone. The Prudence of a year ago would have shrunk from the accusation. She would have apologized, deferred, accepted the blame. But the woman who had spent months with her hands in the soil of Kestrel Chase, who had brought a dead garden back to life, was no longer that person. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She met his gaze directly. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it held the weight of absolute certainty. "The potatoes were sound when they arrived. My quarantine methods were correct. This was not an accident. It was an attack." She turned, not to plead, but to retrieve something from the side table, her estate ledger. She opened it on his desk. The pages were filled with her neat script, detailing every transaction, every decision. "Here," she said, her finger tracing a line. "The record of delivery from the merchant in Saltcliffe, signed by the carter. Here are my notes on the inspection of the first 5 sacks. No sign of blight. And here," her voice was cold and precise, "is the cellar log. The door was locked. Only Obadiah and I had keys." Gideon looked at the ledger, at the meticulous, undeniable evidence of her diligence. He looked at her face, pale but resolute. He had asked the question out of a cold, deep-seated fear, the fear of trusting someone again, the fear of being made a fool of. He had lived in a fortress of his own making for 3 years, and this woman, with her quiet competence and her stubborn belief in growth, had breached its walls. He had let her in. And the thought of her failing, of his judgment failing, was terrifying. From the perspective of Gideon Sinclair, he watched her point to the entries in the book, her finger steady, her voice clear. It was not the passion in her denial that convinced him. He had seen passion before. It was an unreliable currency. It was the ledger. It was the cold, hard, verifiable facts. It was the same relentless logic that he understood, that he trusted. The book was a mirror of her mind, ordered, precise, and honest. And in that moment, looking at the evidence she presented, he realized his question had been a betrayal. Not of her, but of himself. He had married her for this very quality, her reliance on evidence over sentiment. And at the first test, he had allowed the whispers of others, the fear of his tenants, to make him doubt it. He had allowed Fletcher Garrick's polished performance to outweigh Prudence's quiet, consistent work. It was a failure of his own discipline. He had asked if she had brought this upon us.
The word hung in the air between them. Us. When had he started thinking of them as an us? He looked at her, truly looked at her, standing before him not as his employee, not as a duchess, but as a partner under siege. And he felt a surge of cold, protective fury, not at her, but for her. Return to Prudence's perspective. He closed the ledger slowly. He raised his eyes to hers. The coldness was gone, replaced by something she had never seen there before. A hard, resolute fire. Who else had access to the stables where the sacks were first stored? He asked. His tone had shifted. He was no longer the judge. He was the commander. The stable hands, Prudence said, her heart beginning to beat with a fragile hope. One was dismissed a fortnight ago, a man named Jem, for drunkenness. Find him, Gideon said to the empty room, as if issuing an order to the very walls of the house. He looked back at Prudence. Garrick has declared war, Duchess. He seems to have forgotten in whose territory he is fighting. He said Duchess, but the way he said it was different. It was no longer just a title. It sounded like the name of an ally. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The Duke of Kestrel Chase moved with a speed and purpose that startled everyone. He was no longer a recluse hiding in his study. He was a strategist, planning a campaign. Messengers were dispatched. His solicitor was summoned from London. Quiet inquiries were made in the taverns of Merivale about a dismissed stable hand named Jem. Prudence, to her surprise, was not excluded from these preparations. She was brought into the study, his study, and consulted at every turn. He would listen to her careful, reasoned analysis of Garrick's motives and the tenants' fears, nodding slowly, absorbing her words. They were a council of two, their alliance forged in the crucible of the crisis. The dismissed groom, Jem, was located within 2 days. He was found in a cheap boarding house, drinking away a surprising sum of money. When 2 of the Duke's imposing groundsmen appeared at his door, his bluster evaporated into terrified compliance. Brought to Kestrel Chase and seated before the Duke's immense, imposing desk, the man confessed everything. He admitted that Mr. Garrick had paid him 20 silver shillings to slit the bottom of 2 of the potato sacks and introduce a small pouch of rotten, blighted mash he'd been given. It was a simple, vicious act of sabotage, designed to create maximum panic with minimum risk. Jem, consumed by guilt and terror of the Duke's wrath, signed a full confession, which the solicitor duly witnessed and sealed. With the confession secured, Gideon's plan for the public reckoning took shape. He announced he would be hosting a meeting of the local landowners and magistrates at Kestrel Chase to discuss a coordinated response to the regional blight. It was a civic-minded, responsible gesture that no one could refuse. An invitation was sent to Mr. Fletcher Garrick, who accepted with alacrity, no doubt seeing it as the perfect stage for his final triumph. Invitations were also sent to Lady Honora and Louisa Rothwell as prominent members of Merivale society. And a special, personal note was dispatched to Lady Arabella Devereux, a neighboring dowager countess. Lady Arabella was old, sharp-tongued, and possessed an impeccable reputation. Her opinion carried more weight in the county than any man's fortune. She was known for her fierce intelligence and her intolerance of fools. She had, until now, remained a skeptical observer of the goings-on at Kestrel Chase. On the day of the meeting, the great dining room was prepared not for a meal, but for a tribunal. A long, polished table dominated the room. The Duke took his seat at its head, a silent, imposing figure. Prudence sat at his right hand, her face calm, her hands resting on her closed ledger.
She wore a simple dark blue dress, the color of deep water. She was not there as a hostess, but as a principal. The guests arrived, filling the room with the murmur of polite conversation. Mr. Garrick was the last to enter, confident and smiling, the very picture of a concerned country gentleman. He greeted the Duke, then gave Prudence a nod of condescending sympathy. "A difficult time for you, Duchess," he said, his voice pitched for the room to hear. "But we must all learn from our mistakes." Lady Honora, seated further down the table, gave a small, confirmatory sigh of agreement. The Duke waited for the silence to settle. He then rose. "I have convened this meeting to discuss the blight that affects us all," he began, his voice calm and measured. "But before we discuss a general solution, we must be clear about the specific nature of the problem. There have been rumors concerning the methods employed here at Kestrel Chase. Mr. Garrick, you have been vocal in your concerns. Perhaps you would be good enough to share them with us now." It was a trap, beautifully laid. Garrick, puffed up with self-importance, walked right into it. He stood and delivered a polished, eloquent speech about the importance of tradition, the dangers of newfangled ideas, and the tragic, if predictable, outcome of the Duchess's experiment. He spoke of her coastal potatoes as the source of the infection that now threatened them all. He was reasonable, he was charming, and he was utterly convincing. When he finished, a murmur of agreement went through the room. He sat down, a smug, satisfied look on his face. The Duke did not respond. He simply looked at Prudence. "Your Grace?" Prudence stood. She did not look flustered or defensive. She looked like what she was, an expert about to deliver a lecture. She opened her ledger. "Mr. Garrick is correct about one thing," she began, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the room. "The blight at Kestrel Chase did not arise from the soil. It was introduced. He is wrong, however, about the source." With methodical precision, she detailed the provenance of the seeds, the date of their arrival, and the quarantine procedures she had put in place. She presented the evidence of her diligence, the facts of her work. Then she paused. "The blight was introduced to my cellars deliberately," she stated, her eyes locking with Garrick's. "It was an act of sabotage, committed by a former employee, a man named Jem, who was paid to do so." Garrick laughed, a short, dismissive bark. "This is absurd. A desperate accusation from a woman trying to save face. Where is your proof?" "My proof," Prudence said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in, "is right here." From a portfolio beside her chair, she produced a single sheet of paper and laid it on the table. "This is the signed and witnessed confession of the man you paid." The silence in the room was absolute. Every eye was on the document, then on Fletcher Garrick's face. The color drained from it, his handsome features contorting in a mask of shock and fury. "It's a lie! A forgery!" he sputtered, half rising from his chair. "Is it?" The Duke's voice cut in, cold as steel. He gestured to the door. 2 footmen opened it, and the terrified, trembling figure of Jem was brought into the room. "Jem," the Duke said, his voice quiet but menacing, "tell the assembly who paid you to destroy my wife's property." The former groom, his eyes wide with fear, pointed a shaking finger at Fletcher Garrick. "He did, Your Grace. Mr. Garrick did. Gave me 20 shillings, he did." The collapse was total and immediate. Garrick stared, speechless, exposed and ruined in a room full of the very people he had sought to impress. It was then that Lady Honora made her fatal error. In a panicked attempt to defend Garrick and deflect from her own complicity, she jumped to her feet. "It's a trick! This is all a plot by my niece. She has always been deceitful,
full of ambition beyond her station. She was furious that Mr. Garrick showed a preference for my Louisa. Her outburst was a confession in itself, revealing the petty jealousy and greed that had motivated her from the start. She had not only countenanced the rumors, she had nurtured them. Into the shocked silence that followed, a new voice spoke, dry and sharp as snapping twig. It was Lady Arabella Devereux. She had watched the entire proceeding with hooded, intelligent eyes. Now she fixed her gaze on Lady Honora. "Be silent, Honora," she commanded, her voice cutting. "You have made a sufficient fool of yourself for one day." She then turned her eyes, which held a new, profound respect, to Prudence. "It seems to me," she announced to the room, "that the Duchess of Kestrel Chase is not the problem. She is, in fact, the only one here who has offered a single practical solution. Her methods are not dangerous. They are meticulous. And I, for one, would be grateful for her advice on my own estate." It was a public declaration of support, a seal of approval from the county's ultimate authority. The tide had not just turned, it was a tidal wave. Fletcher Garrick was ruined. Lady Honora was disgraced, and Prudence, the quiet, overlooked woman with her scribblings about soil, stood vindicated. That evening, the great house was quiet. The guests were long gone, leaving behind the lingering scent of beeswax and the faint echo of scandal. Prudence walked out into the cool night air, drawn, as she always was, to the walled garden. The moon was high, casting the neat rows of winter greens in silver. The air smelled of damp earth and frost. This was her sanctuary, the place where she had first put down her own roots. She heard his footsteps on the gravel behind her, but did not turn. He came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar comfort now. For a long time they stood in silence, looking at the fruits of her labor. "You were magnificent," he said finally. His voice was low, stripped of its usual formality. Prudence shook her head. "I only spoke the truth. I presented the evidence." "No," he said, turning to face her. "You did more than that. You endured insults and sabotage, and you did not break. You trusted your own knowledge when no one else did." He paused, and the air between them grew thick with unspoken things. "When I married you, I saw it as a solution to a logistical problem. I offered you a title in exchange for your skill. It was a contract." He took a step closer. The moonlight caught the sharp planes of his face, and for the first time she saw not the Duke, but the man, stripped of his armor, his eyes full of a raw, vulnerable emotion she could not name. "I was wrong," he said, his voice husky. "You did not simply rescue the estate, Prudence. You gave it life again. You gave me life again." He slowly went down on one knee, not with the flourish of a courtier, but with the solemn gravity of a man making a sacred vow. He took her hand, the one that was calloused and stained with soil, and held it in both of his. His touch was no longer cool and impersonal. It was warm and firm and reverent. "That contract is fulfilled," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "Now, I ask, not as a duke to his duchess, but as a man. Prudence, will you choose to make this a marriage? Will you choose me?" Tears, which she had refused to shed in humiliation and fear, now welled in her eyes. Tears of a profound, overwhelming joy. He was not rescuing her. He was seeing her. He was choosing her, not for what she could do, but for who she was. She looked down at this powerful, broken man who had found his way back from the shadows by the light of her quiet, steady work. She thought of the cold, silent house that was now becoming a home. She thought of the life they could build here, together, from this good earth. "Yes," she whispered. The word was small, but it held the promise of 1,000 seasons. "Yes, Gideon. Plainly. Yes." He rose, and, with infinite gentleness, he drew her into his arms. And there, in the heart of the garden she had brought back to life, under the silent watch of the moon, he kissed his wife for the very first time. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition, a quiet, certain homecoming. 2 years later, Kestrel Chase was unrecognizable. The parkland was a patchwork of thriving fields and lush pastures. The home farm was a model of productivity, its barns full, its livestock healthy. The house itself was filled with light and warmth, the silent halls now echoing with the sounds of life. Lady Arabella Devereux was a frequent visitor, and her booming laughter could often be heard from the drawing room, where she and Prudence would pore over new botanical catalogues. Lady Honora and Louisa had retired to Bath in disgrace, their social standing in Maryvale permanently destroyed. Fletcher Garrick had sold his estate at a loss and left the country. The tenants of Kestrel Chase, their loyalty now absolute, spoke of their Duchess with a fierce, protective pride. One bright afternoon in late summer, Prudence and Gideon walked through the walled garden. It was in its full glory, heavy with the scent of climbing roses and ripe fruit.
A small boy with his father's serious gray eyes and his mother's determined chin toddled along the path between them, his small hand clutching a bright red apple from the old, revived tree. Prudence knelt, pointing to a flower.
"That's a delphinium, Thomas," she said softly.
Gideon came to stand behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders. He looked from his wife to his son, his face filled with a quiet, profound contentment that had once been unthinkable. Later, in the library, he watched as Prudence took a book from the shelf. It was not one of the grand, leather-bound Sinclair histories. It was a worn volume with a familiar, scarred cover. Her father's notebook. She opened it and showed a page to their son, a detailed sketch of a honeybee. Gideon had had a special case built for the collection. The Rothwell journals now stood on a place of honor, side by side with the centuries of Sinclair family records. They were part of the same story now, the story of Kestrel Chase. A story of how a neglected land and a broken heart were brought back to life by a quiet woman with dirt-stained hands and a belief in the stubborn, miraculous power of growth. He came and stood beside her, placing his hand over hers on the open page. Together. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.